The metal chair felt cold against Commander Zelath's scaled skin as he studied the human sitting across from him. 3 years of war had taught the Nautari officer many things about these strange bipedal creatures, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The detention facility on Station Omega-7 hummed with the quiet efficiency of hegemony technology. Yet somehow the human seemed completely at ease. David Chen looked ordinary enough. Average height for his species, brown hair slightly disheveled from his capture, and wearing the standard gray prisoner uniform. His hands rested calmly on the table between them, no trembling or signs of fear that Zelath had come to expect from captured enemies. Most species broke within the first hour of interrogation. The Korthani would weep. The Velkari would beg. Even the proud Thakari eventually cracked under pressure. But this human just smiled. "You seem nervous, Commander," David said, his voice carrying an accent that Zelath's translator identified as North American English. First time interviewing a human? Zelath's gill slits fluttered slightly, a sign of irritation in his species. "I have conducted over 300 interrogations in my career. I am hardly nervous." 300, impressive, David nodded. But none of them were human, were they? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Zelath had to admit, if only to himself, that the human was correct. In all his years serving the hegemony fleet, he had never encountered a species quite like humanity. Other races followed predictable patterns in warfare. They had clear military doctrines, organized command structures, and most importantly, they knew when they were beaten. Humans seemed to lack this basic survival instinct. "Your species has been causing considerable trouble for the hegemony," Zelath began, activating his recording device. "We offer worlds the choice of peaceful integration or military occupation. Most choose wisely. Humans chose to fight." "We did," David agreed cheerfully. "How's that working out for you?" The question stung because Zelath knew the answer. What should have been a simple expansion operation had turned into a 3-year nightmare. Human colonies that should have surrendered in days held out for months. Human fleets that should have been easily crushed kept finding ways to punch above their weight. Worst of all, every victory against the humans came at such a cost that it barely felt like winning. "High Command wants to understand your tactics," Zelath said, deciding on a direct approach. "Your military strategies are unconventional." David's smile widened. "You want to know why we keep winning when we shouldn't? You are not winning. The hegemony controls superior numbers, better technology, and vast resources. Your victories are temporary setbacks, are they?" David leaned back in his chair. "Let me ask you something, Commander. How many hegemony ships have been lost fighting humans?" Zelath's membrane-covered eyes blinked slowly. The number was classified, but it was far higher than anyone had expected. "Casualties are inevitable in any military operation." "That's not what I asked. You know the exact number, don't you? Because you have to report it up the chain of command every week. You have to explain to your superiors why the primitive humans keep destroying their shiny ships." The human was right, and that knowledge sat in Zelath's stomach like a cold stone. The casualty reports were becoming harder to explain. Hegemony doctrine assumed that technological and numerical superiority would lead to quick victories. Against humans, those advantages seemed to matter less than they should. "Your point?" Zelath asked. "My point is that you're not here to interrogate me about military secrets. You're here because your commanders are scared. They've fought dozens of species across the galaxy, and none of them fought like we do. They want to understand what makes humans different." David was correct again, though Zelath would never admit it aloud. The briefing from High Command had been unusually detailed. They didn't just want intelligence about human military capabilities. They wanted to understand human psychology. What made these creatures so difficult to defeat? Why did they refuse to follow the established rules of warfare? "I will ask the questions," Zelath said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Fair enough, but I think I can save us both some time." David settled back in his chair like he was preparing to tell a story to an old friend. "You want to know why we keep winning? Why your superior technology and numbers don't seem to matter? Why every battle against humans costs more than your commanders expected?" Zelath waited, his training telling him to let the prisoner talk. Sometimes they revealed more when they thought they were in control. "It's because you don't understand what you're fighting," David continued. "You see our ships and our weapons and our soldiers, and you think you're fighting a military. But that's not what humans are. What are you then?" David's smile turned cold. and for the first time since the interrogation began, Zelath felt a chill run down his spine. "We're survivors, Commander. Every single human alive today is descended from creatures that spent millions of years as prey animals on a death world. We survived ice ages, plagues, predators, and each other. We didn't get to the stars by being the strongest or the smartest. We got here by being too stubborn to die." The human leaned forward, his eyes meeting Zelath's directly. "You want to understand human warfare? I'll tell you some stories. Real stories from the battles your people have fought against mine. Maybe then you'll understand what you're really up against." Zelath activated his recording device and settled back to listen. Something in the human's tone suggested these would not be pleasant stories to hear. "Where do you want me to start?" David asked. "The beginning. The first major engagement between our forces." David nodded slowly. "Proxima Station. Yeah, that's a good place to start. That's where your people first learned that humans don't fight fair." The human's smile returned, but it held no warmth. Zelath suddenly realized that he might not be the one conducting this interrogation after all. David Chen was about to teach him something about his own species, and Zelath suspected he was not going to like the lesson. David's fingers drummed quietly on the table as he gathered his thoughts. Zelath noticed the rhythm was steady, almost like a military march. The human seemed lost in memory for a moment before beginning his tale. "Proxima Station was never meant to be a fortress," David said. "It was a mining operation, built around a small asteroid rich in rare metals. 200 people worked there, mostly engineers and miners. When your fleet arrived, the station's AI calculated their survival chances at 0.03%. Zelath's gills fluttered with what might have been amusement. Wise calculations? A mining station against a full battle group. "That's what Admiral Knox thought too," David continued. "Your admiral, not mine. He sent the standard surrender demand, expecting the humans to see reason. After all, 50,000 troops against 200 civilians seemed like an easy choice." The Nautari commander remembered the reports from that engagement. It had been filed as a routine occupation, barely worth mentioning in the larger context of the human campaign. "I assume they surrendered." David's laugh had no humor in it. Commander Sarah Kim sent back a one-word reply. "No." "Foolish pride," Zelath observed. "Many species struggle with accepting defeat gracefully." "You still don't get it," David shook his head. "It wasn't pride. Sarah Kim was a mining engineer, not a soldier. She had 2 children back on Earth and a husband who taught mathematics at a small college. She was about as far from a warrior as you could imagine." The human paused, and Zelath found himself leaning forward despite his attempt to remain detached. There was something in David's voice that suggested this story would not go where the Nautari expected. "Admiral Knox gave her 6 hours to reconsider. Standard procedure, right? Show mercy to civilians, give them time to see reason. But during those 6 hours, something happened that Knox didn't understand. Which was, the humans got creative." David began describing the transformation of Proxima Station in clinical detail. The miners had access to industrial equipment designed to crack apart asteroids. The engineers understood the station's life support systems better than anyone. Together, they began turning their home into something else entirely. They started with the docking bays, David explained. Knox's landing craft needed those bays to deliver troops safely. So the humans filled them with mining charges, not enough to destroy the bay, just enough to turn each landing into a death trap. Every ship that tried to dock found itself caught in a carefully controlled explosion. Zelath's membrane-covered eyes blinked slowly. Irregular tactics, but hardly effective against superior numbers. "Knox lost 200 troops in the first hour," David replied. "But you're right, it wasn't enough. So Sarah Kim tried something else. She began venting atmosphere from specific sections of the station." The Nautari commander felt a chill. Venting atmosphere was essentially opening one's home to the vacuum of space. It was suicide. "She didn't vent randomly," David continued. "Kim understood atmospheric dynamics better than any admiral. She created pressure differentials that turned the station's corridors into wind tunnels. Your soldiers found themselves fighting hurricane-force winds that changed direction without warning. Squads got separated. Equipment was torn from their hands. Simple navigation became impossible." The human described how the miners had flooded certain sections with superheated steam from the geothermal processors, how the engineers had rewired the gravity generators to create zones of crushing weight, alternating with areas of near weightlessness. Every system on the station became a weapon. But the real innovation came when Nox's troops finally breached the intersections, David said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. They found the humans waiting for them. Zelath waited for the rest of the story, though part of him suspected he would not like what came next. Sarah Kim held the reactor room with nothing but a maintenance wrench and 2 mining engineers. For 6 hours she held that room against trained soldiers with advanced weapons. Every time Nox's troops tried to enter, they found the radiation levels spiking to lethal doses. Kim had figured out how to weaponize the reactor's safety systems. Impossible, Zelath protested. The radiation would have killed her too. It did, David said simply. Eventually. But she kept fighting for 6 hours after the levels went critical. The medical team that eventually reached her found radiation burns covering 80% of her body. She was still conscious, still holding that wrench, still defending her post. The silence in the interrogation room stretched for several minutes. Zelath tried to process what he had heard. Military doctrine across the galaxy assumed that civilians would seek safety when threatened. The idea of a mining engineer choosing to die slowly from radiation poisoning rather than surrender challenged everything he thought he understood about warfare. The casualty reports, David continued, showed that Admiral Nox lost 15,000 troops taking Proxima Station. A mining facility that should have fallen in hours cost him 1/3 of his force. And the worst part? Sarah Kim wasn't unusual. What do you mean? Every human on that station fought the same way. The accountant who turned the cafeteria into a gas chamber using cleaning supplies. The teenager on work study who used maintenance robots as suicide bombers. The grandmother who booby-trapped the hydroponics bay with genetically modified plants that released toxins into the air. David leaned forward, his eyes meeting Zelath's directly. You want to know what makes humans different? We don't have soldiers and civilians. When you threaten our homes, our families, our way of life, every single one of us becomes something else. Something dangerous. The human settled back in his chair, watching Zelath's reaction carefully. Admiral Nox filed his report claiming victory at Proxima Station. Technically, he was correct. His forces occupied the facility and eliminated all resistance. But something had changed in how the hegemony viewed human conflicts after that. What changed? The cost-benefit analysis, David replied. Suddenly, every human colony became a question mark. How many troops would it take? How many ships would be lost? How many supposedly easy victories would turn into bloody sieges? Zelath realized he was beginning to understand why High Command had wanted this interrogation. The human was describing a fundamental shift in warfare that the hegemony had never encountered before. Other species fought to win. Humans fought to ensure their enemies regretted starting the fight in the first place. That was just the beginning, David said, noting Zelath's expression. Proxima Station taught your people that humans don't surrender easily. But it took a few more battles before you learned the really terrifying truth about us, which is, David's smile returned cold and predatory. We learn from our mistakes, and we never forget a lesson. Empty space between Saturn and its moons had never seemed so threatening to the hegemony. Fleet. Admiral Nox learned this lesson the hard way during what human historians would later call the Ghost Fleet campaign. David traced patterns on the table with his finger as he prepared to tell Zelath about humanity's most psychologically devastating military tactic. After Proxima Station, your High Command decided to strike directly at the solar system, David began. The thinking was logical. Cut off the head of human resistance by attacking Earth itself. Nox brought 800 ships, the largest fleet the hegemony had ever assembled. Zelath nodded. The numbers matched what he knew from classified reports. An overwhelming force. No military could stand against such power. That's what Nox thought too. Human intelligence estimated our home fleet at maybe 200 ships, mostly older models. On paper, it shouldn't have been a contest. David's expression grew distant. But humans had learned something important from studying your previous victories against other species. Which was, you always fought the same way. Massive fleets meeting in open space. Ship-to-ship combat until one side retreated or was destroyed. Clean, predictable, efficient. It worked against every other species in the galaxy. The human paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Captain Elena Rodriguez commanded a destroyer called Defiant. Nothing special about the ship itself, standard human military design. But Rodriguez had studied every hegemony engagement for the past 50 years. She noticed something your admirals probably considered a strength. Zelath waited, though he was beginning to suspect he would not like where this story was heading. You always won because you were organized. Tight formations, coordinated attacks, unified command structure. Very efficient. David looked up at Zelath with those unsettling human eyes, but efficiency can become predictability. When the hegemony fleet entered the solar system, they found exactly what they expected: empty space. Human ships had vanished completely. Long-range sensors detected no organized fleet, no defensive formations, no signs of the coordinated resistance Nox had prepared to crush. For 3 days, nothing happened. David continued. Nox's fleet advanced toward Earth, expecting the human fleet to appear and offer battle. Instead, they found nothing. But nothing turned out to be something far worse than open combat. The first ship disappeared on the 4th day. The cruiser Dominance simply stopped responding to communications while investigating an asteroid field near Jupiter. When search teams arrived, they found debris scattered across several thousand kilometers of space. Nox assumed it was an accident, David explained. Space combat is dangerous. Ships get destroyed by equipment failures. He ordered the fleet to continue toward Earth. The second ship vanished 2 days later, then a third. Each time there were no distress signals, no signs of battle, just ships that stopped existing. Nox's organized fleet began to spread out, trying to cover more space and locate the missing vessels. That's when Rodriguez struck. David described the destroyer, Defiant, emerging from behind Saturn's moon Titan, like a phantom. The ship had been running cold, all non-essential systems shut down, hiding in the moon's sensor shadow for 6 days. When it finally moved, it targeted the hegemony fleet's most isolated ship. The attack lasted exactly 4 minutes, David said with professional appreciation. Rodriguez hit the ship's engines first, preventing escape or evasive maneuvers. Then she systematically destroyed its communications, weapons, and life support. Finally, she put 3 missiles into the reactor core. Zelath's gills fluttered with agitation. 1 ship against a fleet? Suicide tactics. That's what Nox thought too. He sent 40 ships to converge on Rodriguez's position, expecting to end this harassment quickly. David's smile was cold. They found nothing. Defiant had vanished again. The human described a campaign of pure psychological warfare. Human ships would appear without warning, strike at isolated vessels, then disappear back into the void. They used the solar system itself as a weapon, hiding behind planets and moons, using asteroid fields and debris clouds to mask their approach. Nox tried everything, David continued. He tightened his formations, but that made his fleet slower and easier to track. He spread his ships out to cover more space, but that left individual vessels vulnerable. He sent hunter groups to search for the human ships, but they just became targets themselves. The hegemony admiral found himself fighting an enemy that refused to face him directly. Every day brought new losses. Ships would simply vanish from the fleet roster, picked off one by an enemy that struck like lightning and disappeared like smoke. The worst part was the uncertainty. David explained. Nox never knew where the next attack would come from. His crew started jumping at shadows. Sensor ghosts became major threats. Ships began reporting contacts that weren't there. Zelath realized what the human was describing went beyond simple tactics. This was warfare designed to break the enemy's mind as much as their ships. How long did this continue? 3 months. Rodriguez and 11 other ship captains turned the entire solar system into a hunting ground. They used every asteroid, every moon, every debris field as cover. Nox's massive fleet was reduced to helpless prey, watching their numbers dwindle while chasing phantoms. The human described how Captain Rodriguez alone accounted for 12 hegemony cruisers. Her destroyer Defiant became a legend among both fleets, a ship that could appear anywhere and disappear just as quickly. Nox's crews gave it a name in their own language that translated roughly to Death Shadow. But the real genius wasn't just the tactics, David continued. It was the message Rodriguez was sending. Every attack told Nox's fleet the same thing. Nowhere is safe. We can reach you anywhere. You will never see us coming. David paused to let that sink in. Nox's fleet had superior numbers, better technology, more firepower. But morale became his biggest enemy. His crews started requesting transfers. Ships began developing mysterious technical problems that required them to withdraw for repairs. Some captains simply refused to follow orders that would take them into areas where human ships might be hiding. The psychological pressure finally broke the hegemony fleet when Nox's own flagship was attacked. Rodriguez brought Defiant out of hiding during a supply transfer, striking at the heart of the enemy fleet. Though the destroyer was finally destroyed in the battle, the message was clear. No one was safe, not even the Admiral himself. Knox withdrew from the solar system 3 days later, David concluded. His surviving ships jumped for hegemony space, abandoning the campaign entirely. Officially, the retreat was described as a strategic redeployment. Unofficially, Knox's own officers reported that their commander had suffered a complete nervous breakdown. Zelath sat in silence, processing what he had heard. The idea of a smaller fleet defeating a larger one through psychological warfare was completely outside his understanding of military doctrine. "You're describing terrorism, not warfare," he finally said. David's expression hardened. "No, Commander. Terrorism targets civilians to influence governments. What Rodriguez did was pure military strategy. She identified her enemy's weaknesses and exploited them ruthlessly. The fact that those weaknesses were psychological rather than technological doesn't make her tactics less valid." The human leaned forward. "Your people like to fight according to rules. Honor codes, established procedures, predictable patterns. That works fine against enemies who follow the same rules. But humans don't follow your rules." "Then what do humans follow?" David's smile returned cold and predatory. "Results. We fight to win, Commander. Everything else is just details." Rain fell steadily on the battlefield outside New Geneva Colony, turning the red soil into thick mud that clung to everything. David's voice took on a different tone as he prepared to tell Zelath about Dr. Lisa Park, and the Nautari commander noticed the change immediately. Where previous stories had carried notes of pride or dark satisfaction, this one seemed to weigh heavily on the human. "Every species in the galaxy has agreed to certain rules of warfare," David began quietly. "Medical facilities are neutral. Doctors and nurses are non-combatants. Hospitals are safe zones where enemies can be treated without fear of attack." Zelath's gill slits fluttered in agreement. These were ancient laws honored by every civilized species in the galaxy. The hegemony has always respected medical neutrality. "That's what Dr. Lisa Park believed too," David replied. She had served as a field medic in 3 different conflicts, always under the protection of medical conventions. When the Battle of New Geneva began, she was treating wounded soldiers from both sides in a clearly marked hospital complex. The human described a chaotic engagement where hegemony forces had pushed deep into the colony's defensive perimeter. Human military units were falling back in good order, but the fighting was fierce and casualties were mounting rapidly. Dr. Park's field hospital was processing hundreds of wounded from both armies. Park was a pacifist, David continued. She had joined the medical corps specifically because she believed in healing rather than harming. Her personal philosophy was that all sentient life was sacred, regardless of species or allegiance. Zelath found himself leaning forward. There was something in David's tone that suggested this story would challenge his assumptions about human nature even more than the previous tales. "What changed?" he asked. David's expression darkened. Commander Vorth's battalion overran the hospital perimeter. Instead of respecting medical neutrality, Vorth decided that the facility was too strategically valuable to leave in human hands. His troops stormed the complex. The human described chaos erupting in what should have been a sanctuary. Hegemony soldiers burst into operating rooms where Dr. Park was performing surgery on both human and alien wounded. Patients who couldn't be moved were executed in their beds. Medical staff who protested were shot. Park was in the middle of removing shrapnel from a hegemony soldier's chest when Vorth's troops entered her operating room, David said. She looked up at the soldiers and asked them to wait until she finished saving their comrade's life. Zelath's eyes narrowed. "That seems reasonable." "Vorth's lieutenant shot the patient on the operating table," David replied flatly. Then he told Park that the hospital was now a military facility, and she had 30 seconds to surrender or be executed as an enemy combatant. The silence in the interrogation room stretched for several heartbeats. Zelath tried to imagine how any reasonable person would respond to such a situation. Surrender seemed like the only logical choice. Dr. Park looked at the dead soldier on her table. David continued. She looked at the wounded humans and aliens lying helpless in the corridors around her. Then she did something that Commander Vorth never expected. "What?" She got angry. David described Dr. Park's transformation with clinical precision. The pacifist medic who had spent her entire career healing others began systematically turning her knowledge against the invaders. She started with the medical nanobots, microscopic healing machines that she reprogrammed to attack specific biological systems. Park knew more about hegemony physiology than most of your own doctors, David explained. She had been treating your wounded for years, studying your anatomy, understanding your biological weaknesses. When she decided to fight back, she didn't use weapons. She used medicine. The human described how Dr. Park released clouds of modified nanobots into the hospital's air system. The microscopic machines sought out specific biological markers unique to hegemony species, causing massive organ failure within minutes. Soldiers who had entered the hospital healthy began collapsing in the corridors. But that was just the beginning, David continued. Park turned every piece of medical equipment into a weapon. Surgical lasers became precision guns. Defibrillation units became electrocution devices. She even used medical scanners to identify the weak points in hegemony armor. Xylith felt his gill slits contracting with stress. You're describing war crimes, am I? David's voice turned cold. Commander Vorth violated medical neutrality first. He executed wounded prisoners under medical care. He turned a hospital into a battlefield. Park simply adapted to the new rules that your people had established. The human described a running battle through the hospital complex that lasted for 18 hours. Dr. Park used her knowledge of the building's layout to set traps in every corridor. She booby-trapped medical supplies with explosives made from sterilization chemicals. She turned the hospital's pharmacy into a chemical weapons factory. The most effective tactic was psychological, David explained. Park used the hospital's communication system to broadcast medical data about each hegemony soldier as they died. Heart rate, brain activity, cellular breakdown. She gave a detailed scientific commentary on exactly how each of her weapons worked. Xylith realized what the human was describing. Dr. Park had turned healing knowledge into a form of torture, using her understanding of biology to maximize both physical and psychological trauma. Vorth's troops found themselves fighting an enemy who understood their bodies better than they did, David continued. Every breath they took might contain modified pathogens. Every surface they touched might be coated with contact poisons. The very air around them became toxic. The siege of the hospital ended when Dr. Park ran out of ammunition for her improvised weapons. By that time, she had eliminated over 200 hegemony soldiers, while evacuating most of the human wounded through underground tunnels. When Vorth finally cornered her in the children's ward, David said quietly, Park was surrounded by 6 young human patients who were too injured to evacuate. She had spent the last of her medical supplies keeping them alive. What happened? Park made Vorth an offer. She would surrender and accept execution if he agreed to let the children be evacuated to safety. David's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Vorth agreed. Park walked outside, knelt in the mud, and let him shoot her in the head. The interrogation room fell silent again. Xyloth found himself struggling to process what he had heard. The idea of a pacifist becoming so deadly, then choosing to die to protect children, challenged everything he thought he understood about human nature. The medical corps issued new protocols after New Geneva. David eventually continued, Any attack on a medical facility is now considered a declaration that medical neutrality has been suspended. Human medics are trained to fight as effectively as any soldier. That violates galactic medical conventions. David's smile was sharp and unforgiving. So did shooting patients in their hospital beds. The difference is that we learn from our mistakes. The human leaned back in his chair, watching Xyloth's reaction carefully. You wanted to understand human warfare, Commander. This is what it looks like. When you force us to choose between our principles and our survival, we'll abandon the principles every time. And you don't see anything wrong with that? I see a species that refuses to let their enemies dictate the terms of their own destruction, David replied. Dr. Park spent her life healing people. Your Commander Vorth turned her into something else. The responsibility for what she became lies with the person who made that choice necessary. Silence filled the vast communications center as the final transmission came through from Kepler Station. David's hands clenched involuntarily as he prepared to tell Xyloth about humanity's most costly victory, a battle that had changed the entire trajectory of the war. The Nautari commander noticed the human's tension and found himself sitting straighter in his chair. Kepler Station was humanity's farthest outpost, David began, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been present in the previous stories. 37 light-years from Earth, built around a gas giant in a system that most species considered worthless. 5,000 humans lived and worked there, mining rare isotopes from the planet's atmosphere. Xyloth nodded. He remembered the intelligence reports. Kepler Station had been classified as a low-priority target, too remote to matter strategically. An isolated mining facility, hardly worth significant military attention. That's what Fleet Admiral Korvax thought too, David replied. He brought 200,000 troops to take a station defended by 5,000 civilians. The mathematics seemed simple enough. The human described how Admiral Korvax had approached Kepler Station with overwhelming confidence. Intelligence suggested that most of the defenders were engineers, miners, and support staff. A few hundred actual soldiers were stationed there, but nothing that could resist a full-scale invasion. Major Tom Anderson commanded the station's defense force. David continued. He was a logistics officer, not a combat commander. His job was managing supply shipments and maintaining equipment. When Korvax's fleet appeared, Anderson faced a choice that would define the rest of the war. Surrender or die, Zelath observed. Simple mathematics would suggest surrender. David's expression hardened. Anderson called for volunteers. Anyone who wanted to evacuate could use the station's emergency pods to reach the outer system. No judgment, no shame, just an honest choice between probable death and certain survival. The human paused, seeming to gather himself before continuing. 300 people took the evacuation pods, mostly families with children, some older workers, a few who simply couldn't face what was coming. The remaining 4,700 chose to stay. Zelath's gill slits fluttered with confusion. They chose to die? They chose to send a message, David corrected. Anderson made it clear that they couldn't win. The best they could hope for was to make the victory cost more than Korvax expected. Maybe enough to make the hegemony think twice before attacking the next human colony. The human described how the defenders of Kepler Station began their preparations with grim efficiency. Unlike previous battles where humans had improvised weapons and tactics, this time they had weeks to plan their final stand. They started with biological warfare, David said, his voice taking on a clinical tone. The station's medical bay had samples of Earth viruses stored for research purposes. Modified influenza, engineered bacterial infections, synthetic pathogens designed to study alien immune systems. Zelath felt a chill run down his spine. Biological warfare was considered barbaric even by hegemony standards, used only in the most desperate circumstances. Anderson's team released modified pathogens into the station's air system 3 days before Korvax's troops landed. David continued. Viruses that were harmless to humans but deadly to most hegemony species. By the time enemy soldiers breached the outer sections, they were breathing death with every breath. The human described a landing operation that turned into a nightmare for the hegemony forces. Soldiers began collapsing within hours of entering the station. Medical teams couldn't identify the pathogens, couldn't develop treatments, couldn't even determine how the diseases were spreading. But Anderson wasn't finished, David said. He had 4,700 people who knew they were going to die. Each one became a weapon. The defenders turned every corridor into a killing field. They used mining charges to create improvised bombs, welding equipment to fashion flamethrowers, and industrial chemicals to generate poison gas. The station's life support systems became delivery mechanisms for increasingly deadly surprises. The reactor core was Anderson's masterpiece, David explained. He couldn't destroy it immediately because that would end the siege too quickly. Instead, he began a controlled overload that would build for days. Radiation levels crept higher hour by hour, forcing Korvax's troops to fight while slowly dying from exposure. Zelath realized what the human was describing went beyond military tactics. This was systematic self-destruction designed to maximize enemy casualties. They poisoned their own home. They weaponized their own home, David corrected. Every room became a trap. Every piece of equipment became a bomb. Every breath of air became potentially lethal. Anderson turned Kepler Station into the most expensive real estate in the galaxy. The siege lasted for 2 weeks. Korvax threw wave after wave of troops into the station, expecting organized resistance to collapse once the defenders realized the hopelessness of their situation. Instead, he found humans who fought harder as their situation became more desperate. The final transmission came from Anderson himself, David said quietly. By that point, radiation levels were lethal throughout most of the station. His own troops were dying from exposure as fast as the enemy soldiers. He was alone in the command center, surrounded by the bodies of his staff. What did he say? David's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. This is what it costs to fight humans. Remember that. The human described how Anderson triggered the final overload manually, turning Kepler Station's reactor into a weapon of mass destruction. The explosion could be seen from 3 star systems away. When the radiation finally cleared enough for investigation, Korvax found that he had lost over 80,000 troops taking a facility that no longer existed. The casualty reports made interesting reading. David continued. Korvax had brought enough troops to conquer a dozen systems. He lost nearly half of them taking a single mining station defended by people who weren't even soldiers. Xylath sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what he had heard. The idea of an entire population choosing death over surrender was completely outside his understanding of rational behavior. It changed everything, David explained. Before Kepler Station, hegemony commanders assumed that threatening human colonies would force quick surrenders. After Anderson's last stand, every human settlement became a question mark. How many troops would it take? How many ships would be lost? Was any human colony worth the potential cost? The human leaned forward, his eyes meeting Xylath's directly. Anderson achieved something that no human military victory could have accomplished. He made the hegemony afraid of us. Fear is not victory, isn't it? David's smile was cold. How many human colonies has the hegemony attacked since Kepler Station? How many times have your commanders chosen to bypass human settlements rather than pay Anderson's price? Xylath realized the human was correct. Strategic planning had shifted significantly after Kepler Station. Targets that would have been routine operations against other species were now classified as high risk when humans were involved. We don't fight just to win battles, Commander, David said. We fight to ensure that our enemies remember the cost of fighting us. Anderson and his people are dead, but their message is still being heard in every hegemony war room in the galaxy. The interrogation room fell silent again. Xylath found himself wondering if this human's stories were becoming more disturbing, or if he was simply beginning to understand what he was really hearing. There's one more story, David said eventually. The worst one. The one that explains why you're really here. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as David Chen settled back in his chair for the final time. Xylath noticed that the human's demeanor had changed subtly throughout their conversation. What had begun as casual storytelling had evolved into something that felt more like a lecture. The Notari commander was beginning to suspect that he had never been in control of this interrogation. You've been very patient. Commander, David said, his voice carrying a note of appreciation that somehow managed to sound condescending, listening to my war stories, trying to understand what makes humans different from other species. But I think you've missed the most important point. Xylath's gill slits fluttered with irritation. Which is? These aren't extraordinary examples of human warfare, David replied. They're typical. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Xylath felt his breathing slow as the implications sank in. What do you mean, typical? David's smile was gentle, almost paternal. Commander Sarah Kim at Proxima Station, Captain Elena Rodriguez with the Ghost Fleet, Dr. Lisa Park at New Geneva, Major Tom Anderson at Kepler Station. These weren't heroes, legends, or exceptional individuals. They were ordinary humans doing what ordinary humans do when they're threatened. The human stood up and began pacing the small interrogation room, his movements casual despite the restraints on his wrists. Every human child learns these stories in school, Commander. Not as tales of extraordinary heroism, but as examples of normal human behavior under pressure. Xylath found his voice catching in his throat. Normal? We call it Tuesday, David replied with dark humor. Sarah Kim was a mining engineer who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rodriguez was a mid-level naval officer with a standard destroyer. Park was a pacifist medic. Anderson was a logistics specialist. None of them were special forces, elite soldiers, or military geniuses. The human stopped pacing and turned to face Xylath directly. You want to know what makes humans dangerous? It's not our technology, our tactics, or our weapons. It's that we don't see war as a game with rules. We see it as survival itself. David described human military doctrine with the same clinical precision he had used for the battle stories. Human children were taught from an early age that if something threatened their family, their home, or their way of life, there were no limits to acceptable responses. Mercy was a luxury that could only be afforded after ensuring survival. Other species fight to win battles, David explained. Humans fight to ensure their enemies never want to fight them again. It's a fundamental difference in psychology, that your commanders still don't understand. Xyloth realized that everything he thought he knew about the human war effort was wrong. He had assumed that the brutal tactics, the refusal to surrender, the willingness to die rather than submit were aberrations, signs of desperation or fanaticism that would fade as the war continued. Every human soldier knows they're expected to fight like Sarah Kim, like Rodriguez, like Anderson, David continued, not because they're heroes, but because that's simply what humans do. When you corner us, when you threaten what we care about, when you give us no choice between submission and destruction, we choose destruction. Every time. The human sat back down, his expression becoming almost sympathetic. That's why you're really here, isn't it? Not to gather intelligence about human military capabilities, but to understand why we won't break. Xyloth's membrane-covered eyes blinked slowly. The human was correct, though the Nautari would never have admitted it voluntarily. High Command was becoming increasingly concerned about human psychological profiles. Other species eventually reached a breaking point where continued resistance became impossible. Humans seemed to lack this basic survival mechanism. 3 years of war, David observed. Hundreds of battles, thousands of casualties, dozens of planets fought over. The hegemony keeps winning tactical victories, but somehow the strategic situation keeps getting worse for your side. The human was right again. Despite superior numbers and technology, hegemony forces found themselves increasingly reluctant to engage human targets. Commanders requested additional troops for operations that should have been routine. Casualty projections for human conflicts were consistently underestimated. Morale problems were becoming endemic. You can't break us because we're already broken, David explained. Every human alive today is descended from survivors of ice ages, plagues, wars, and disasters that wiped out entire civilizations. We're not fighting to maintain some comfortable status quo. We're fighting because fighting is what we do. The human leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And here's the really terrifying part, Commander. Everything I've told you, these stories of desperate last stands and impossible victories, they're not even our best work. Xyloth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. What do you mean? David's smile returned cold and predatory. Kim, Rodriguez, Park Anderson, they were all regular military personnel or civilians caught in combat situations. But humans have other kinds of soldiers, Commander. Specialists who are trained specifically for impossible missions. The human described elite units that Xyloth had only heard whispered about in classified intelligence briefings. Special forces teams that operated behind enemy lines for months at a time. Soldiers who were trained to think like humans but fight like something else entirely. The worst part is that you'll never see them coming, David continued. Regular human military units announce themselves with ships and uniforms and formal declarations of war. Special forces just make things start breaking. Equipment fails. Supply lines are disrupted. Key personnel disappear. By the time you realize you're under attack, the damage is already done. David stood up again, this time moving to the small window that looked out over the detention facility. How many unexplained accidents has your fleet experienced in the past month, Commander? Ships developing mysterious technical problems, computer systems failing for no apparent reason, personnel going missing during routine operations? Xyloth's gill slits contracted involuntarily. There had been several incidents that defied easy explanation. Nothing dramatic enough to suggest sabotage, but a pattern of small failures that was beginning to concern security personnel. They're already here, David said simply. Human special forces have been operating in hegemony space for over a year. Not fighting battles, just gathering intelligence and preparing for what comes next. The human turned back to face Xyloth, his expression serious. You wanted to understand human warfare, Commander. This is what it looks like when we stop playing defense and start taking the war to you. David moved back to his chair but remained standing. Your High Command is right to be worried. Not because humans are unbeatable, but because we never stop learning. Every battle teaches us something new about your tactics, your technology, your psychology. We adapt faster than you can change strategies. The interrogation room fell silent as both participants considered the implications of what had been said. Xyloth realized that this conversation had not gone according to plan. Instead of extracting information from a prisoner, he had been receiving a briefing from an enemy intelligence officer. Why are you telling me this? Xyloth asked finally. David's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since the interrogation began. Because in about 6 hours, a human rescue team is going to attack this facility and extract me. Your security systems have already been compromised. Your guards have been replaced with human operatives, and your communication networks are under our control. The Nautari commander felt his breathing stop entirely. Impossible, is it? David gestured toward the door. When was the last time you received a status report from your security chief? Have you tried to contact the command center recently? How do you know that anyone beyond this room is still under hegemony control? Zeloth reached for his communication device and found nothing but static. Emergency channels were dead. Even the facility's internal network seemed to have vanished entirely. The humans you've been fighting for 3 years are miners, engineers and logistics specialists, David said, moving toward the door.
The ones who are coming for me tonight are something else entirely.
Professional soldiers who have been planning this operation for months. The human paused at the door, his hand resting on the control panel. You wanted to understand what makes humans different, Commander. We don't just fight wars. We study our enemies, learn their weaknesses, and then we make them irrelevant. David activated the door controls with an override code that should have been impossible for him to know. The portal slid open silently, revealing corridors that were conspicuously empty of guards. I'd recommend that you contact High Command immediately, David said as he stepped through the doorway. Tell them that this war is about to change in ways they're not prepared for. And Commander? Zeloth looked up at the human, wondering how his prisoner had become his captor so smoothly. The next time you capture a human, David said with that cold smile, don't bother interrogating them. They'll tell you exactly what they want you to know, and by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Zeloth alone in a room that no longer felt secure. As he reached for his emergency communication device, the Nautari commander realized that David Chen had given him exactly what High Command had requested, a complete understanding of human warfare. The knowledge was far more terrifying than ignorance had ever been.